Have you fallen in the last 3 months? When you go to the doctor because you've fallen, it's obvious that the answer is yes. Recent experiences have taught me to be more careful around trailer hitches and big steps. Watch your step has become a more important warning in my life, whether stated or just thought. Watching our step keeps us from falling. In a sense, Jesus instructs his disciples to watch their step. Their conduct can affect not only their spiritual lives, but that of others. Read with me from Mark chapter 9, verses 42 through 50. And if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a large millstone tied around his neck. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than with 2 hands to go into hell, where the fire never goes out. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than to have 2 feet and be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with each other. Well, there's no question what this paragraph is about. We notice the repetition of the phrase cause to sin. In some translations, it's cause to stumble. Alan Black said it is important to interpret this section in connection with the previous teachings of chapter 9, verses 33 through 41. For the most part, it continues the theme of servanthood and the rebuke of a haughty, self-serving spirit. It is important for us to remember the context. The disciples argued about who is the greatest. Jesus responded by placing a child in their midst and telling them that to be first, they must become last of all and servant of all. John tried to change the subject by telling about the man casting out demons in Jesus' name. He said, but we tried to stop him. Well, Jesus rebuked them for that. Our text continues this same basic theme. And the first thing that Jesus says is, don't cause others to sin or stumble, verse 42. He speaks of one of these little ones who believes in me. Now, this is not just children. It can be any believer. And as we've already mentioned, causing one to sin, you could also translate that, and it has been translated, cause to stumble. The word comes from a Greek word, scandalon. Sounds a lot like our English word scandal, doesn't it? And really the root meaning of the word was a piece of the trap used to catch animals. Sin, stumbling, in a sense, is like the trap, taking us away from doing the will of God. Now, how would they cause others to sin or to stumble? Well, that could include their squabbles about greatness. It would include these little ones. Could it even include the man casting out demons? Because they discouraged him from casting out demons, which he apparently could do. He could be discouraged. He could even turn away from Jesus because of their rebuke and negative attitude. Well, certainly the Bible warns of many ways we can cause each other to sin. Now, we must note we're ultimately responsible for our own sins, but it is sinful to contribute to the sins of others. How do we cause others to stumble or sin? Well, jealousy and competitiveness, as with the 12, harsh judging and criticizing, being inconsiderate of others' feelings and scruples, always insisting on our own way, discriminating against people because of poverty or the color of their skin, gossip, driving people away through embarrassment. Jesus warns sternly against causing someone else, one of these little ones who believe in him, to sin or stumble. He gives that warning, that stern warning, because it is so easy to do. It is easy to cause another person to stumble. One thing you discover with small children, and then later on with small grandchildren, is you not only have to watch your step, you have to watch the steps of toddlers, because they don't always watch where they're going. And if you come into contact with them, you may fall on them. Not a good thing. It's easy sometimes in some settings to stumble. Spiritually, it's easy to cause others to stumble. And so we must try very hard not to. We have to watch our own words, our own behavior. Jesus said it would be better for a person who causes one of these little ones to sin, it would be better for them to be thrown into the sea with a large millstone around his neck. Well, it may be that you haven't seen a millstone in recent days. I remember in years past occasionally seeing one of the big millstones. Sometimes it was no longer being used, it was just kind of sitting out there. But what you have here is a lot of weight. This was a very familiar thing to the ancient person living in Jesus' day, because millstones of various sizes were used in the processing of grain. If you had a heavy weight tied around your neck and you were thrown into the water, you had very little chance of surviving. A way of putting it in modern terms that we've probably seen on some movies and television shows is to be thrown into the river with a set of concrete boots. You're not going to come out of that situation alive. The 12 had better listen up and adjust their attitudes toward one another. If they cause others to stumble, the outcome is going to be terrible. We contrast that with verse 41. In verse 41, if you do something basically insignificant, welcoming one of these, you get a reward. In contrast to that, there will be punishment instead of reward. David Garland said, Jesus promises a reward to outsiders who show Christians a bare minimum of goodwill, but he threatens Christians with dire judgment if they cause the little one who believes in him to slip. We can infer, I think, that God shows more concern for the little one's fragile faith than for the great one's fragile egos, which cause them to lord it over or to ignore others. I think this even helps to explain verse 50 later in our text. It says there, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Then the instruction is, have salt in yourselves and be at peace with each other. As the salt of the earth, from another text, we know that we're to be different. One way that we're different is to be at peace with each other. That's a salt we always need in the church. There's so much strife in our world. There's strife in families and marriages. Too often there's strife in churches. But if we seek to follow the way of Christ, to have the salt in ourselves, we will work to be at peace with each other. Well, first Jesus says, don't cause someone else to stumble or to sin. And then he makes it more personal. Don't do anything to cause yourself to sin. Jesus here talks about cutting off the hand, the foot, or putting out the eye. He says it would be better to do that than to go into hell having both hands, both feet, both eyes. Jesus here is using hyperbole. That's exaggeration. It is not literal, since mutilating oneself physically really won't stop sin. But Jesus is not just making a joke, by no means. He's making a very serious point. He is saying whatever it takes to avoid being lost, do it. Sin arises from the heart and from the mind of a person. We must do everything we can to avoid sin. This was not a demand for physical self-mutilation, but in the strongest manner possible, Jesus speaks of the costliest sacrifices. Earl Macmillan said, "No amount of the amputation of one's limbs could assure the correct attitude of heart." No, what Jesus is saying is you look at where you are spiritually. You look within to the heart. And he's basically saying, as William Lane says, whatever in one's life tempts one to be untrue to God must be discarded promptly and decisively, even as a surgeon amputates a hand or a leg in order to save a life. There are times that a Christian will try to keep some behavior in his life that is at least questionable. And sometimes that behavior will cause him to sin. It could cause him to lose his soul. Martel Pace said, "No one ever used stronger language in speaking of hell than did the loving Son of God." Jesus, when he refers about going into hell, yes, is giving a strong warning. Hell is serious business. The hell spoken of here is the translation of the word Gehenna. That's the Greek form of the Hebrew valley of Hinnom. This was a valley just south of Jerusalem. It was the place where two of Judah's kings, Ahaz and Manasseh, sacrificed their sons to idols. In the Old Testament prophets, it was a place of judgment. By the time of Jesus, it was the city garbage dump. There were fires always smoldering there, and that came to symbolize eternal punishment. We should note this is not the same as Hades, which is the place of the dead. When we die, we go to the place of the dead. But Jesus is here speaking of Gehenna, a place of punishment. Jesus says this is the place prepared for the devil and his angels. It's described as the second death in the lake of fire in Revelation chapter 21. This is a place of exclusion from the presence of God forever. Well, we're very acquainted with the imagery of hell being fire. We even speak of hellfire. But we notice also that there's a reference back to, I believe it's Isaiah. There the worm does not die, and the fire is not quenched. If the fire doesn't destroy something, there's still the worms there. And I think what is probably pictured here is maggots. I never like it when I discover maggots somewhere. I have actually remembered my stomach turning at the sight of them. But imagine this place, fire, maggots. It's not a place you want to have anything to do with. We usually don't visit a garbage dump unless we just have to. When I drive by one going up to the Metroplex, I try to remember to put the air on recirculate so I don't have to smell even what's coming from the trash mountain there at Alvarado. But Jesus uses a very vivid picture. And hell is a terrible place. We do not want to go to hell. We would not like the climate. We would not like the clientele. God will be in heaven, not in hell. Well, that might bring up the question, why would God want to send anyone to hell? The answer is he doesn't want to. And he doesn't do the sending. God has reached out to us in love and grace through the gospel. If we refuse his offer of salvation, hell is the only alternative. And to be away from God, that's our decision. Some stay a great distance from God in this life. They should not expect to be with God in the next life. The decision is ours. We might also notice here that Jesus is talking about hell, and he's not so much here talking to people who were alien sinners, that is, who had never come to faith in him. He is talking about religious leaders who rejected him and led others away from him. And he's addressing the disciples. He's talking to them in Mark chapter 9. He is warning those who have followed him now for about 3 years. He is warning them against thinking they can live just any old way because they are his disciples. We should not presume on God's grace. And that's why we should do everything necessary to avoid hell, no matter what we have to sacrifice. We should get rid of everything in our lives that stands between us and being disciples of the one who gave all for us. The last couple of verses of our text have been described as obscure, hard to understand, and some texts are a bit hard to understand. Everyone will be salted with fire. That probably means everyone's going to be put to the test. Just as Israel's sacrifices were accompanied by salt, we need to be sure we are presenting our bodies as living sacrifices, Romans chapter 12. And Jesus says, don't lose your saltiness. We dare not lose our saltiness. To do so would be to lose our very souls. Well, we wonder, okay, how does salt lose its saltiness? We buy today pure salt, whether it's the old-fashioned stuff in the round box or whether it's that fancy sea salt. It's pure. What you had in ancient times was not 100% sodium chloride or whatever it is. There were minerals with it. And over a period of time, the actual salt could kind of evaporate or go away. And you were left with something that kind of looked like salt, but it no longer tasted like salt. And more importantly, it no longer could preserve or influence like salt. The disciples have a great responsibility. Discipleship is a serious thing, and we cannot truly be Jesus' disciples without taking discipleship and taking Jesus with the utmost seriousness. The disciples have an eschatological responsibility toward men in a world that is subject to the judgment of God. Jesus warns the disciples that they can lose their salt-like quality, which can mean life for the world. And here salt typifies that quality which is the distinctive mark of the disciples, the loss of which can make him worthless. The exhortation to guard their salt-like quality in order to be at peace with one another has a direct bearing on the situation of strife, which provoked the conversation in verses 33 and following. What is to set one man apart from another is not the distinction of rank or worth, but the quality of saltiness. The disciples were arguing about who's the greatest. Jesus says what matters is, do you have your salt? Are you the salt of the earth? Strife is resolved and peace restored when men and women recognize in one another a common commitment to Jesus and the gospel and to the servant's vocation. The warning is given that one should be careful not to endanger or lose his quality of serving in the world as a preservative. For many, many years before refrigeration, salt was used to preserve. You had to have good salt to do that. It didn't work if it just looks like salt. The Christian, then and now, must work against losing his saltiness, his influence. Well, the original question that started all of this, who is the greatest? That started it. But Jesus says the real question is, are you helping one another and yourselves get to heaven? You do that by being very careful not to cause someone else to sin. And of course, by starting at home with yourself and being very careful that you don't sin. Well, it's very good to watch our step in the physical life. it's more important to always watch our step spiritually.